We said, hey, you know that most people in an organization have no idea who you are. So if you dress like a boss, they'll treat you like a boss.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. Another episode of The Art of the Fail, Season 2. Today, as always, we have another amazing guest. We are joined by Patrick Lor, Managing Partner of Panache Ventures. Did I say that correctly?
You did.
Okay, perfect. Partner with 500 startups, as well as co-founder of iStock, and more recently, Dissolve. So, Patrick, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
It was my pleasure.
And as always, we like to get started with what we, I guess, once used to call rapid fire questions, but
working title.
Very working title. You'll soon find out for the listeners and Patrick as well that they're not so rapid.
I like them though.
I like them too. They're fun. So all right, let's get started. First question, Patrick, what did you have for breakfast this morning?
I had a banana, and then I did a few calls, and then I on my last trip to San Francisco, I stocked up on some salmon jerky from Trader Joe's.
Oh,
So
wow.
I had half a bag of salmon jerky too.
Banana and jerky. That's quite the combo to kickstart the morning.
That's a unique one. We always
Yeah.
get different. With the last, what was your friend Sanjay ate pizza at
Oh, right.
at
Yeah, you
7
had
a.m.
cold. Yeah, right.
That's awesome.
I'm not going to lie, actually. Oddly enough, the banana and the jerky is kind of making me hungry in
Yeah.
like a very weird way. But all right. How many cups of coffee or tea do you drink in a day?
Typically only one a day.
Okay. That's good. I think, wow, today probably by 10 o'clock I had already had 3 cups. I had 3 cups of coffee, and my pulse was literally just like dum 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 dum. And then I was like, all right, Christian, it's time to kind of chill on the coffees or anything caffeine related for the day. Your alarm clock goes off. Do you hit the snooze and try to catch a few more Z's, or are you the type of person that just gets up right away?
I almost always hit the snooze because I'm an optimizer. So if I can squeeze another 5 minutes of sleep, I'll do it.
I love it. I love how you put it into that context too. It makes
You
it
flipped
actually
to the positive.
It makes me feel so much better.
Actually, I just recently learned there was this I forget the lady's name, but she was in this interview and she was talking. I think she wrote a book about it too, the 5-second rule. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. And it's like
with food.
no. That's she said if she had to do it all over again, she'd change the name.
Right.
But it's like if you want to do anything, and it started with her actually getting up in the morning. It was if you count down from 5, and then she went behind and actually talked about the psychology of it. It's not just one of those like get rich quick hoaxes, but she went into the psychology of it, in what your mind does when you're actually doing that count, and incredible. Like there's a whole slew, thousands of people who have said that this like rule and this framework has really helped them basically change those like bad habits. But anyways, it's interesting.
Awesome. iPhone or Android?
Android.
Android. Best book that you have either listened to or read. This could be something that happened either recently or even of all time, if one kind of comes to mind.
Well, yeah, I have a long list of books that I love.
Yeah.
But I guess the one that's probably nearest and dearest to my heart is one by my friend Guy Kawasaki. It's one of his older ones. It's Art of the Start. And the reason why I love Art of the Start is because Guy thanked me in his foreword for this.
Oh, awesome.
Back in the iStockphoto days, we ran a contest to design the cover of Art of the Start on iStockphoto.
Really cool.
Oh, that's
And so yeah, one of the designers that was on iStockphoto actually designed the cover. But I think we had over 100 entries on Artist Start. So it's quite a special book
Wow.
for us because it contains iStockphoto's logo, it
Hmm.
contains my name, and the cover was designed by one of our artists.
That's cool.
That's really
That's
cool.
really cool.
Yeah, that would definitely do it for me. Social media. Do you hate it or do you love it?
Um, I think social media, whether you hate it or love it, is the reality. I find that I was just spending too much time on social media, and so I've actually stopped. So I've other than LinkedIn, which I use as a business tool,
Yep.
I stopped using Facebook and I stopped using Twitter, and so now I rely on my friends to tell me what's going on.
Smart, efficient. All right, last and arguably the most important question. Are you ready to officially get started and start talking about some failures?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's dig in.
Awesome. Let's do it.
So, Patrick, can you tell our listeners a little bit more about you, and hopefully this will sort of get a discussion going, and starting in your early years and the companies that you were starting, maybe some of the companies that you started and failed, and then through your journey. Let's give us a little context here.
Sure. I don't know how far you want to go back, but maybe I'll go back to, over 50 years ago when I was born. I was born in Hong Kong,
Yeah.
Hmm.
and my parents decided to immigrate to Canada. And I guess subconsciously I was kind of learning about what kind of sacrifice it takes to build a better life. So my parents were, hardworking middle class people. Dad was an electronics repairman. Mom was an elementary school teacher, and they had to give that all up to move to Canada. And it's not that they couldn't find jobs in Canada. It's just that their English skills weren't good enough for them to find the same jobs in Canada.
Right.
So, a bunch of years later, we find ourselves in Calgary, and my mom and dad are running a grocery store. And that was really where I kind of learned about, the value of hard work and how hard some people have to work to put food on the table. And in fact, I guess is how hard most people have to work to put food on the table. So, we're talking about 12 and 14-hour days of keeping the store open. I was there, collecting bottles that were returned to the store. I was mopping floors, stocking shelves, et cetera, right?
Hmm.
And then one of the things that my parents kept on telling me was listen, Pat, you have to study hard, and if you don't, all of this will have gone for naught. Like we should have just stayed in Hong Kong and just lived comfortable middle class lives. And so I went to university, and I guess my first fail was almost getting kicked out of school. I went to the University of Calgary, and my first year GPA was 1.58. And
Is
so
that on
that-
the 12
That's what
point
I was.
scale
That's
in
what I was
Canada?
going to ask. Yeah,
the
12 or
12-point
4.
scale or
Yep.
the 9-point scale. No, actually, it wasn't quite that bad. I think that would almost get you an automatic expulsion. But it was on the 4-point scale.
Right.
And so just a little bit of background on that, and just to tell you a little bit about more what that means. Is that a 2.0 is essentially a bare minimum that you need to get going, right? That's a C. And if you had a D, that's a 1.0, and obviously anything below that is unsatisfactory. They basically decided for probation, you need or if you got anything between a 1.5 and a 1.99, you were going to be put on academic probation.
I got that.
I got that as well. So
Yeah.
it's something that the three of us have in
So
common.
it's awesome.
Yeah.
All these entrepreneurs, maybe that should be the entrepreneur test, is whether or not you get put on academic probation.
Yeah.
But anyways, I was put on academic probation, and it was just, I guess as I reflect on it, there were a couple of things. Number one, I just wasn't interested in what I was studying in. Number two, I was lazy. Number three, and probably most importantly, I just wasn't engaged. I just somehow could not get into school, could not understand how it related to work. I was actually a really, really hard worker. So summers, I was really engaged in summer work. So that was really my first taste of what it would, what it felt like to actually fail something, right? So I failed a bunch of courses, I barely passed a few others and got to that point. And that came to kind of the first turning point in life of what I would do. So
what's interesting there, sorry to cut you off, is you're talking about your university, right? And you took a BA in sociology, right? Yeah, I have the same degree, the same piece of paper, and I just think it's interesting that because I can relate a lot to what you said about how you just couldn't get in to the subject matter or how it related to work or real life, and but you still had that hard work ethic. Where do you think that work ethic comes from? Because we've heard similar stories, particularly of children of immigrant parents too.
Right.
And usually the immigrants that are coming to Canada or the US, they actually are entrepreneurs themselves and start a business. And do you think that's sort of innate in you?
Yeah, I think it's informed by a variety of things. So I guess just to fill in the blanks a little bit more, I was actually trying to get a science degree or trying to get into med school or something really, really, where all the smart people go. Right. But I just didn't study hard enough, and that's how I got onto academic probation. And then the choice there was to really, buckle down and work hard on something that I didn't really love. Or to pick something that I could tolerate and move on with it. And it turned out that one of my best grades was in a sociology course, and it just happened that because I got a B+ in that course, that determined what that piece of paper was going to be.
That is literally the exact same thing that happened to me. I looked down at my degree audit because I was in business. But there's a lot of math in first year business, and I looked down at my degree audit. She's like, "You can't stay in this program," and I was like, "Okay. Oh, there's my highest mark, sociology. I guess we're going into that."
Mine is. It's funny because mine is like very similar to the both of you in that regard, except it was how I chose what I went into university, like what I decided to study in university. I looked at my high school grades and I said, I'm naturally good at biology, didn't have to put in any work, so this must be what I want to do. So I chose bio, and the rest is kind of history after that.
And it sounds like it's probably not a unique thing. It probably happens to a lot of people.
Yeah, and there's a little bit of science behind this. Cal Newport wrote this book called So Good They Can't Ignore You. And what he talks about is it's an iterative process. So you have to be good to be engaged, and you have to be engaged to be good. So for instance, the example is if you can't be interested in skiing if you're constantly falling and breaking something. Right. And so people love to ski, but they only love to ski because they're good at it. If you took a brand new skier and put them at the top of a Black Diamond Hill, they would hate it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And so I think that we have to be careful, and this is a lesson for the way that we engage customers, the way that we engage employees, and the way that we treat ourselves as far as how we engage ourselves in things is give ourselves a chance to get good at things and give ourselves a chance to engage in an activity before we dive right in. And it's hard to be good the minute that you dive into something. Right?
Absolutely.
And so I think I learned a real lesson in that. Hey, the mission of getting a science degree or a medical degree or a law degree wasn't my mission. It was my parents' mission. And love my parents, but I just wasn't engaged with it. So so having gone through the sociology degree, I think that taught me a few things that I continue to use today, which are things surprisingly enough, I think it taught me a little bit about strategy. Aside reading all those papers, it taught me a little bit about how to deal with human psychology, for instance, right, and groupthink, et cetera, et cetera. For one, for example, I took some courses on organizational behavior, and it basically said, hey, you know that most people in an organization have no idea who you are. So if you dress like a boss, they'll treat you like a boss. And so as a junior employee in my first job, I wore a tie to work every day, and sure enough, it just worked. Right. And so,
Interesting.
So I think
That's
that
a cool story.
taught me a lot about entrepreneurship, which is, show up looking like you know what you're doing.
Yeah, totally. So walk us through the next steps. What happened once you had that shiny sociology degree in hand? What was your next move and sort of journey to entrepreneurship?
Yeah, from there, it's just a story of me stumbling into a bunch of things and just being really, really lucky. I think what I had going for me was I had a really good work ethic. So even though school wasn't for me, I found myself in jobs where no matter what it was, I would put in 10 or 12-hour days. I was just 100% engaged. It was almost the opposite of school.
Right.
So I ended up with a job at the marketing department at the Parks and Rec department here in Calgary. And I just learned a ton about marketing. So marketing back in the day, this was in the early 90s, it was essentially about print and about advertising. And so that's where I cut my teeth. I bought a Macintosh back in the day. And so if for the people that are looking at this online,
I was seeing that.
that's my original Mac
That's
up
awesome.
there.
Love it.
Paid $5,000 for that thing, and $90. So, or $1985 it was. It was a year after the original Mac 128 came out.
Wow. That's
Anyways,
awesome.
That's amazing. That's an artifact right there.
It's a super expensive piece of equipment, but it's where I learned. It's where I typed all my papers. It's where I designed a bunch of brochures, et cetera, et cetera. And I just took that skill set and I did it for a marketing department. And really, as I learned more about how to lay out brochures, I started learning more about marketing, and that's where I started to learn my craft. Did that for about 4 years, and then landed a job at Adobe Systems right here in Calgary. It was the Image Club Graphics division, and that was a company that sold fonts and clip art and photos on CD-ROMs and diskettes. And again, this is pre-internet days. This is where we put CD-ROMs and diskettes into FedEx packages, and we would ship them to people overnight. And it's amazing. I mean, that was only about 20 some odd years ago, right? And this is how much business changed.
Yeah, that's crazy. So do you think that, because you said like any job you got into, you'd work really hard, like 10 to 14-hour days. Was that a fear of failing in that position or that job or to that boss? What do you think was the motivator to work that hard?
For me, I'm a little bit obsessive about finishing the job. So I could never be the guy that leaves, leaves a laundry pile in a room, that leaves a pile of dishes in the sink, right? They kind of have to be done.
Right.
And so it was just the same approach when it came to a job, is that when somebody gave me a job, I really wanted to finish it, that day. And so, and that's kind of what I became known for, is people would drop a little project on my desk. And if I started on it, I would finish it, right? And it would be on their desk the next morning. And so for me, it was a little bit more of an impulse than anything else. I think that overall, though, it wasn't so much fear, but it was a hunger to learn. And so when people would put something in front of me that I didn't know how to do, I would just click all the buttons in whatever application I was using, just to try to figure out how to use that app and figure it out and get it done. Right?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I'm sure many people have different motivations for
It's a good mindset.
starting.
It's a good mindset to have because it sounds like every single situation you looked at it more of an opportunity to better yourself rather than being like, oh shoot, like here's another thing that I have to do, which a lot of people do. You get, I don't know how many people were dropping off projects, probably by the end of your stint there, quite a bit if you were the go-to guy. But a lot of people dwell on that. They're like, great, not another project, where you kind of took it upon yourself just to completely own it, for the company, I'm sure, but for yourself probably first.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a lot of great mentors and supervisors to thank, because I was fresh. I didn't really know what I was doing, so a lot of the projects that they dropped off on my desk, I would be very eager. I would work on them. It would be fast. I would turn it around, but I'd screw up a lot of these projects as well. And back in the day when you screwed up a project for print and it went to print with a mistake in it, it would cost sometimes hundreds of dollars and sometimes thousands of dollars.
Right.
And luckily, I had supervisors that said, "Hey, listen, thanks for the effort. We knew that you were really pedal to the metal on this one, so don't worry about it. We'll just get it reprinted, right? Or we'll just use these ones as is." And so, just a lot of forgiveness. So I think that my lesson from those kinds of failures is really like aren't people aren't computers. People aren't calculators. They don't just say, "Hey, you made a mistake," or you did well, and it's not so binary of a decision. They'll also take into account what your effort was, and I think that they appreciate that. And so I think that on our more human side of working with people, they'll take that into account, and you might even work with people that make more mistakes. Because you just you found an affinity, you found a relationship that can continue based on that trust.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of this saying, but it's definitely the more that I do and the more that I learn, the your network is your net worth saying. Didn't Sheetal say that too at the?
Yes. Yeah.
But it's true, and so one of the things you brought up that I thought was interesting, because I'm sure a lot of people are thinking this, whether they're entrepreneurs or even if they're just employees at a company. What was the foresight to actually seek out mentors, or were those just embedded into sort of the Adobe org structure? Because I think that's definitely been a catalyst in a lot of my learnings, but I never would have thought of that. Like, I only learned that through ecosystems and startup help things, and and that was never something ingrained in me. Like, oh, you need a mentor, or a mentor would be beneficial. So, interested to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever officially sought a mentor, but I think mentors just happen. So I think of the kind of the weirdest situations in life, and I think they are when you go and ask people for certain things that shouldn't be asked. They should just end up developing.
Right.
So, for instance, if I went to you guys and said, "Hey guys, would you be my friends?" All right.
Well, I would say yes, but
yeah, you would say yes, of course. But, that would just be weird as hell.
Yeah.
And I think that I still think of people coming up and asking me to be their mentor is just weird. And I'm very glad that people, and very humbled that people see me as worthy of being their mentor, because I don't think you bestow these things lightly. But at the same time, I think these things take time to develop. It's a relationship. And so for me, I think that I just developed relationships with people that where I constantly sought their advice, and they saw enough in me to invest their time in giving me their advice. And again, I'm very, very thankful for this. I think that overall, we as humans can only learn if we're self-aware if we have some self-awareness, right? I think if we go through life and we're not reflecting on the things that we've done and people's reactions to us, I think you end up being tone deaf. And I think we know of, some very famous people in the geopolitical climate out there today that are very tone deaf. That they never get the truth from people. And I think one thing I have to thank my mentors for is just making me aware of what my the consequences of my actions were, right? And so very thankful of that. And I think that today I do a very light form of mentorship for people that haven't even asked for my mentorship, which is to say, hey, listen, be aware of this, or hey, this is the kind of feedback that I want to give you because I think this is the way the world perceives you, right? And so hopefully, without going so heavy as to making me as being mentoring people, hopefully I can just start distributing little pieces of advice to people that I see throughout all my business dealings.
It's an insightful way to look at it.
Absolutely.
So if you take us now, after your tenure at Adobe, is that like, obviously you've had a long history in the sort of audio video world. Was that inspiration then for iStock?
Well, after Adobe, I went back to school because at Adobe, at Adobe I hit a glass ceiling. I wanted to be a manager. I wanted to, I thought I was working hard enough. And I contributed enough to be a VP there. But I was just constantly told that, no, hey, Pat, you're doing great at what you're doing. So, keep doing it. Right. And I think that it was an interesting lesson for me. And I'd failed before I even knew it, in that I just didn't have the strategic mind to contribute at the executive level for that company. And I think it meant a couple of things. One is that you just don't even understand what your weaknesses are when you're just 24/7 working heads down into delivering what you need to deliver. And I think I did a pretty decent job at what I was supposed to do. But what I really wanted to do, I had no insight into. Right? And so for me, the lesson there was really to understand what you need to deliver today, what you need to deliver medium term, and what you need to deliver long term. And if you think of yourself as, let's say, a 5-year-old, nobody expects a 5-year-old to go and make a salary tomorrow, right?
Right.
But I think in 15 or 20 years, you expect that 5-year-old to be a 20 or 25-year-old that's got a career plan, that has an education, that has some job skills, right? And so where does that process start? And I would argue that it starts now. That process happens every single day. And so, his 5-year-old has to learn how to walk, learn how to run, learn how to read. That's 95% of a 5-year-old's job. And medium term, it needs to learn, it needs to understand, or he or she needs to understand what school they're going to, who their friends are, what kind of people they're going to be. And then in 20 years, they need to understand what they're going to do with their lives, right? And I think if we took that same approach as 30-year-olds or as 40-year-olds or even 50-year-olds, I know what I'm doing today. Am I clear on what I want to do 10 or 20 years from now? Right? And nobody expects me to know exactly what I'm going to do, but I need to have the vision for that. Right?
And I think I don't know what I would call it, the society, I guess, or even particularly in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, there is from my perspective, a lack of patience too. And so I think that's indicative of what you're saying is you can't expect some of those things to happen so quickly, but you do have to have a plan and a vision for it. So
yeah. Well, I think the entrepreneurial society, entrepreneurial ecosystem measures on basically one metric, right, which is essentially growth.
Right.
And so if you're not growing your company, it's really, really hard to value it. So
Hmm.
what I would look at is, and the metrics are fairly simple. If you look at a company that's doing $5 million in revenues with 10% growth versus a company that's doing $1 million in revenues with 300% year-on-year growth, that the company doing $1 million in revenues is worth more, right?
Right.
And so I think that if you're not part of the startup community, part of the tech community, the VC community, this is hard for people to understand,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Is that we really only look at growth, and that has certain consequences on our activities. Is that now there's some unnatural things being done? Is that VCs might be putting too much money into companies, and that entrepreneurs are forcing growth. They're paying
Hmm.
for growth
Hmm.
rather than finding organic growth. And so it's not necessarily a good thing. I think it was good for a lot of companies, but it's not necessarily great for all companies.
Yeah, and you're seeing some of the companies that had to manufacture growth early on, but they never, took the time to find a sustainable business model fizzle out. There's plenty of examples of that where the unit economics just don't make sense. And but there was, that one metric that was growing, so that's all that mattered.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about your iStock days. Where did the inspiration for that come? And because from what I understand, it was a fairly positive outcome. I'm sure there was a lot of hurdles that ultimately ended up in that exit.
Yeah, iStockphoto was really interesting. I just graduated with a fresh new MBA. This was around 2001, and I was looking for an opportunity that I could sink my teeth into. And so I was looking at a variety of things. I think that my experience before was okay, but not necessarily great. So I put my resume in to get a corporate job, but I didn't really have a great corporate resume, so I wasn't getting a lot of callbacks. So I started looking at ventures that I could join because, coming from tech, I felt like it felt like I was just getting a lot more traction there.
Hmm.
So I was a pseudo entrepreneur at that point, having been at Adobe and having done some marketing type work. So I ended up just running into Bruce Livingston. He was formerly at Adobe, and he had built iStockphoto as a traditional photo company. And traditional photo company back in the day meant that you took a bunch of photos, you scanned them, and you pressed them onto CD-ROMs, and you shrink wrapped them, and
Right.
you FedEx them to people when they ordered them. You know. And so at that time, he had taken out a $50,000 loan to create this company, and he had something like 10,000 CD-ROMs sitting in a warehouse somewhere, sitting in the back office.
Wow.
I
And
just threw out a spindle the other day.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And so it was a failed business because he just wasn't moving enough CDs.
Right.
But what he had done was he had taken all his photos and he had created a little site, which was also called iStockphoto, and he essentially created a community site
Hmm.
with a stock photo. So he said, "Listen, I want to build a big collection of photos. So if you want one of my photos, why don't you upload one of yours, and we'll trade." And the entire community can participate in this gigantic, bake sale of stock photography.
Hmm.
And so it kind of grew slowly at that point to a few thousand. I don't know, it was probably 3 or 4 thousand images at that point, and a few thousand members that could contribute images. And I think you have to remember back in the day, in the 2000 2001 timeframe, digital cameras weren't weren't readily available to consumers.
Right.
Right. So Kodak had this digital camera back, which fit on the back of Canons or Nikon cameras, and it was the cost of a Honda Civic to buy one of these things. It was like I think it was a 2 megapixel camera or something like that.
Wow.
Right. And then Canon a few years later came out with his camera that was a 3 megapixel camera, digital SLR for about $3 or $4 or something like that. So most people were still taking photos, with film cameras and then scanning them, which was this timely and expensive process, right? So it was a little site that was semi-interesting, but wasn't super interesting. So Bruce and I just basically, thought that, well, listen, this is interesting, but we've got to find some other ways to pay the bills. So Bruce had a web services company. So during the days, we would help people build websites. And we did consulting and all that kind of stuff. And then at night, we would just work on iStockphoto, just work on getting more photos up on there. We were scanning photos, we were uploading photos, we were trying to sign up more members, et cetera, et cetera. And then we were also working on a plan to monetize, so that if you wanted to buy photos, if you didn't have any photos that you could scan and upload, that you could participate in that, right? So it was really interesting how timing just brought us to that point where we had failed. We were just at the point where CD-ROMs were failing, and where the internet was just taking off. Right. And just a couple of years after that, Canon came out with the first digital Rebel. It was a $1,000 digital SLR that was 6.3 megapixels. And we just saw our supply of high quality photos just go through the roof. Right. And so for us, that was really lucky. It was kind of right place, right time kind of thing. And that's when the business really took off. And that was when we were able to kind of stop doing the services thing and kind of pay ourselves a salary to work on iStock. And
the grind of most startups.
Yeah, exactly.
What was, just because for my own curiosity there, what was that, I would say, I mean, if you want to call it this, the pivotal moment where both yourself and Bruce realized that, okay, the growth that we're seeing is kind of all right. We're at maybe 3,000 or 4,000 images here. We've got a user base, we've got a community, but it's not growing at the rate that we want it to, and it's not quite as interesting as we want it to be. Like, what kind of sparked you to, I guess, become really aware of that, or was it something that you were just thinking about over and over and over again, and how you could grow it?
Well, we were always somewhat skeptical about the growth of iStockphoto, because we started charging 25 cents a photo. And we just couldn't wrap our heads around how many millions and millions of photos we would have to sell before we could ever pay ourselves a decent salary. Right. And so I would say we were our own, worst critics. We were very skeptical about whether or not our numbers could get there. But in the end, when we sold iStockphoto in 2006, I think we were on track to sell something like 12 million images that year. We had actually raised the price of images. We started selling on different resolutions. So I think that you could buy a low res photo for $1, but you could buy a higher res photo for $3.
Right.
When I started my first digital agency, I used iStock, and I had to increase the price of my websites to be able to pay for the higher resolution stock photos. I thought it was a genius business model, so I'm a proud and happy customer.
That's amazing.
Yeah, for sure. And so yeah, it was interesting that even we couldn't believe the numbers when we got there. So I think it was our community and our fans, our customers, that really brought us there. And so, yeah, I mean, but it was a grind for us in the early days. I mean, we just really didn't have a clue as to what the potential was. We were just trying to make a living.
Right.
Right? We were just scanning photos, trying to sell more photos, trying to pay our internet bills, all that kind of stuff.
Well, and it's interesting that you brought up timing because I find the story fascinating. I didn't know that there was the analog component to all of this before, which is just I find it super fascinating. And I think we've talked about this a lot about how the one thing that almost every startup or company, or we have other individuals listening to this, like just people in general, need to succeed or to make a break or to get that uptick is timing, and it's unfortunately, at least to my knowledge, not that controllable. But some of the things you need are stick to itness and some good grit. But it's also interesting how that timing played out, I think, later on, at least just speaking from a customer's perspective, which is partly the reason why I'm so interested in this story, is there were no other options. So at least there were no free options, no good free options, because now, I'd love your take on this, but there are, sites like Unsplash and things like that where you still, obviously you get what you pay for, but there are a lot more options to get around that. Whereas I was happy to pay that because I could incorporate it in the cost of my websites and my designs and things like that, and I knew I was getting quality. But it's interesting how timing plays a role in all of that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that well, just to give people an idea of what happened back in the day. So if you're looking at the kind of 2001 to 2006 timeframe, there weren't a lot of competitors in stock photography, and there weren't a lot of choices. The choice was really was that we had a lot of clones that were copying iStockphoto, but they were really drawing from the same supply pool as we were, which was essentially amateurs trying to shoot photos that mimicked what professional photos looked like. So, Chris, I think you'll remember back in the day, your choice was spending $1 to $5 on iStockphoto or one of the competitor site out there, or spending $500 on Getty Images or on Corbin.
Yeah.
And so we had customers basically tell us, hey, if you guys got better images on your site, I would spend all my money with you. But as it turns out, your images are too crappy. So that was feedback. That was kind of feedback version 1. Feedback version 2 was, hey, you guys are you guys are pretty crappy, but but $3 is all I want to spend on a photo, so I'll work with crappy images.
Right. So how did you? Sorry to cut you off. How did you do the whole Airbnb model where you did you take that feedback and incentivize, or somehow control the quality of the photos to increase that?
We did. One of the things that we did, well, there were a couple of things that we did. Some of it is pure math, and some of it is around building community. So Bruce was and still is the ultimate community builder. He went out and he worked with a lot of our top photographers to basically train them on becoming better photographers. And so he would fly to their cities. He would hold these things called iStockalypses, which were essentially training conferences on taking better photos, right? And that had the effect of not only producing great photos, but it had the effect of producing great community, right? The other thing that we did was I started looking at the numbers, and the numbers really said that, hey, listen, you're making $200 a month. This camera is about $1,000. Why don't we just give you this camera? And why don't you promise to pay us back $1,000 in a year or two, right? Because we know you can pay it back. We know that you're making enough money off the site. And what that did was that really shot up the quality of the supply coming online. And so we approached it from a community building and from a skills training point of view. And then we also approached it from a from a just a practical, what equipment do you need and can we make the numbers work point of view. And that in combination was super, super powerful. And what we saw was our community constantly shooting on better equipment and just shooting better images. And we just progressively got the product better and better.
It's probably a rising tides effect too, right? If you see the rest of the community shooting higher quality photos, then you're more inclined to shoot higher quality photos.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that what people started to do was they started, started looking at photos on Getty and started just copying them, right? And so I think before people would just take photos without staging them, without lighting, without whatever. And now that they had better equipment, and now that they saw that, hey, wait a second, these guys can actually sell decent business images, they would start scouting out better office locations, and they would start getting their friends to do their hair and do their makeup and bring, better clothing, right? And so it would look a little more fashionable. It would look more like a actual photo shoot, right? And that really ups the game, because I think people were just taking bad photos before, because that was what was available. They would just pick up a camera and just start randomly shooting because that was easy.
Right. I want to be respectful of your time, but the last thing I might probe you on is you tried to start a couple companies after iStock. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, I joined a company called Photo. They were a competitor to iStockphoto. They originated mostly in Europe, and they approached me to help them build their North American market. So we built up the North American office. Eventually, that sold to Adobe Systems for $800 million. Wow. So that was a hell of an exit. So it was kind of like I almost worked for Adobe a second time in my career.
Awesome. Patrick, is there anything else that you wanted to say? Is there any juicy, failure that you wanted to share before we go into our last little bit?
I see a ton of failure in not only in the things that I do, but in the companies that I invest in. I guess the one thing that I would have to say is that if we dig below the surface on what it means to be successful, or to be a failure, is to see that people only show you what they want you to see.
Right.
And so I think that you guys as entrepreneurs will say, hey, these VCs look really, really successful. And it's because we have these multi-million-dollar funds. We've got a ton of companies that are seemingly successful in our portfolio. And the reality is that when you look behind the scenes there, not every company we invest in is successful. And it's hard work to raise a fund. We're raising a $40 million fund right now, and that's not easy. And so there's a couple of things in there that I think I want young entrepreneurs to watch out for. Number one is that if raising money doesn't mean you're going to be successful. Raising money just means that you've been able to convince a VC that you might be able to make money. And convincing a VC is actually not even the right person to convince, right? You actually need to convince thousands and thousands of customers
right.
to have a great product. That's ultimately what you need to do. A VC is a person that, if you look at their track record, you would never want to do business with them if you understand what the track record was. There's like over a 90% failure rate on VC's decision making, right?
Yeah.
So I'll expect that over 90% of my portfolio will fail, but the one that I win will hopefully make up for the rest of it, right? So that one win will pay back the entire portfolio and more. And so that tells you that if you get any VC stamp of approval on day one, they write you $1 million check and they go, great, Chris, go and do your thing. You're awesome. That means very little.
Yep.
and statistically, it means less than nothing.
Yeah.
Um, and so just keep that in mind, is that if a VC says yes, it doesn't mean you're going to succeed. And if a VC says no, it doesn't mean you're going to fail. Right? That's super, super important, right? And ultimately, the only thing that matters are your customers, right?
Yeah.
And the community around you.
Yep.
And I think that I really admire companies that go out and figure out how to do the bootstrapping thing. It means that it either means that they're fed up with this VC game, or VCs have said no and they've decided that that's their only path. To make it as a bootstrap company, that's an amazing thing these days, right? So just watch out for that. Our opinions, are kind of surrounded by all this kind of mystique around how we've made money, how we've been successful in the past, and I can tell you that it means virtually nothing.
Yeah. No, and that's why we're doing this. So I appreciate that perspective. Pat, the last thing that I just want to ask, and I know you've actually been a really amazing help in recommending other folks to share their failures and their stories. But do you have anyone in mind that you would like to call out that you think has, they have some really good stories that people could learn from? Is there anybody that you would call out?
Yeah, well, I have my friend Michele Romanow in Toronto. I really like how humble she is, and how she's just super honest about what a grind it is to go through and build companies. She's I believe, on her third company right now. It's called Clearbank.
Yep.
And she's just working her butt off, and she makes no bones, and she's very, very honest about how tough it is, right? And she'll talk about how what a struggle it was for the past companies, and how past success really doesn't really give you any points for future success as well. Right? So just because you've done it a couple of times doesn't mean that you get any free points for doing it going forward. But I've got an awesome story about Michele Romanow, my friend Michele Romanow.
Okay.
Is that 10 or 12 years ago, after we sold iStockphoto, I was being asked to do a bunch of stage appearances, and so I just ended up in Toronto. I ended up at the U of T graduation hall, where there were 1,000 people in the crowd, and I got a chance to tell the iStockphoto story. Right? And so that was a lot of fun. So there were a lot of students around, a lot of young entrepreneurs around, and this young, bubbly, energetic girl came up to me and said, "Hey, Pat, I'm from Calgary too. I'm out here doing my degree, and I've got this caviar business that I'm running, and I'd love your advice on it." Right? And I said, "Yeah, hey, listen, fantastic that you're doing this business. I love your hustle. I love how hard you're working at this. Doing a degree and running a caviar business. So listen, if the schedules work out, let's meet up back in Calgary when you're back home, right?" And we never did get a chance to meet. But 11 years later, I'm on a call with Michele, and she says, "Do you remember me?"
Wow.
And I said, "Remind me." She goes, "Well, you know how, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, you were speaking in Toronto at this event, and there was this girl that came up to you and asked you about a caviar business? Well, that was me."
Wow. That's crazy.
So yeah, that's to me, that's there's a couple of lessons, and there's one, if you meet any arrogant VCs out there, maybe this is a story
And
for
I have.
Yeah, and you have, of course you have. hopefully they'll just think back that that hey,
Mm-hmm.
anything could happen. Your college kid today might be
Mm-hmm.
your billionaire founder,
Right.
in 10 years, right? And it's not that it's not that much of a stretch of the imagination,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then I think also that there's a couple of things out there is that, and I think we can do this, we can all do this, right? Which is along our path of entrepreneurship, along this journey, is that there's always somebody that's behind us, right? Looking for advice on how to get to where we're at,
Mm-hmm.
and we should always be generous with our encouragement and our advice, right? And so that's my message. That's my call out to a great Canadian entrepreneur. And I had lots of fun today, guys. Thank you for inviting me to the show.
Thank you
you're
so
welcome.
much, Pat. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. That's it for today.
That's it for today.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
All we need is just love.
And thank you. No, not you. Yeah. Thank you for watching today's episode.
Thanks, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Before you leave, please subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you know when we put out new content. And there's some recent videos somewhere here, okay? Check those out because we got a lot of good content, a lot of good episodes for you, a lot of failures, a lot of fuck-ups, including our own.
That's it.
Right.